But with the new EU Due Diligence Act, the issue is getting the attention it deserves. In our next panel discussion, our experts will dive deep into the various aspects of the law and whether it will actually prevent human rights violations. Our experts are Guido Palazzo, Professor of Business Ethics at HEC University of Lausanne, Dr. Sarah Tischer, Head of Group Compliance and Responsible Business Program Manager, Neumann Gruppe, Sofie Nordström, the co-founder and Deputy CEO of Quizrr, and Dr. Thomas Uhlig, lawyer and partner at KPMG Law. Welcome to all the panelists.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our panel on supply chain due diligence. I'm Thomas Crick. I lead the ESG solutions practice of EQS Group. We basically develop software to help companies manage corporate sustainability and progress on their path towards sustainability. Now, today's topic, and we've had it teed up very nicely by our colleagues, well, not colleagues, but friends Lulauer, Sarah Tischer, and Guido Palazzo. Thanks so much. Lulauer gave us a really comprehensive overview of all those regulations coming around the world, particularly in Europe, in regards to supply chain due diligence, most expressly the focus on basically improving human rights along global supply chains. There's a big European law coming up, and yeah, the overall intention is reduce the prevalence of human rights abuses, improve working conditions along global supply chains. And this is the question we want to dive into. Can we expect that to work? Are those laws fit for it? Will a compliance-oriented approach oriented along these laws kind of serve the purpose? Or is there potentially more that we could do? So you've already seen a fair bit from Sarah Tischer and Guido Palazzo. Maybe just a few more words of introduction for the new kind of members in this group. Here in the studio with me, Dr. Thomas Uhlig from KPMG. So maybe, yeah, just to add to the intro that was there. Your main area of practice, I understand, is supply chain and product compliance. You've worked with more than 15 companies over the last couple of years to basically start implementing comprehensive systems. Really glad you're here.
Thank you.
And Sofie Nordström from Quizrr. Hang on a moment. I think it's worth losing a few words around what Quizrr does. Founded in 2023, it makes learning accessible, inclusive, and engaging for employees worldwide. One could put it into this ed tech box. Your software seeks to enable businesses to proactively address human rights issues in their supply chain. You yourself, you bring 20 years of in-depth experience with corporate responsibility and human rights in due diligence, working closely with companies around the world. Also great to have you and to complete this panel of 4 great and knowledgeable people. So let's dive in. Maybe to my panelists, we can assume that quite a few people will be tuning in that haven't looked at all the sessions, so don't hesitate to repeat some of the things that you said earlier. My first question really is, and Guido, you kind of touched upon this to a fair degree. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are 11 years old. They ask for the state to protect and companies to respect human rights. Now, we've got all these laws that are being passed around the world, particularly in Europe, putting an increasing burden on companies to drive alignment with human rights along supply chains. Do you think this is a necessary and the right path that governments are taking there in the European Commission, Guido?
I think it is. What we did in the last 30 years, we focused especially on volunteer engagement of companies, and we didn't make much progress. So I think to enforce human rights management by laws is a very important change. It's, however, coming with some problems. And I would like to highlight one. And here we can probably draw an analogy to compliance in general. When I teach compliance, I always ask my students, what do you think is the industry with the highest level of regulation? And the answer is banking, financial industry. And then I show them a randomly picked bank and the fines they paid over the last decade. And what you see is year after year after year, big violations with punishments up into the billions of dollars. To have compliance regulation as such will not change a lot if the spirit is not there. If you try to do the minimum, you have to choose a more cultural, ethic-based approach to really make it effective. But again, I think it's important to have the laws. It's a change maker. Now everyone has to engage in it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Guido. So you're saying these laws are important and they're generally the right way, but we have to be sure a purely compliance-driven approach is not going to cut it. There will be need for cultural shifts and changes, for different mindsets, and also for enforcement. Interestingly enough, that was also a subject that came up yesterday when I asked Desiree Fixler on what her view is from a US perspective, looking at Europe. What is Europe perhaps less good at than the US? It's that enforcement question. There's a lot of very detailed laws, but in the sustainability space, yeah, a lack of enforcement capacity, yep. So that's one angle. From a pure practitioner's perspective, Sarah, you did give an overview of what NKG Group is doing, but how do you look at, and you've been doing this for a while, what difference do these laws now make for you?
I agree with Guido that these laws are a very important step towards making global supply chains more sustainable and fair. I do think that a big difference is that now there is a common ground for different companies on what is expected from them. However, I also agree with Guido that, as I elaborated before, that there are certain challenges. And one big challenge which we always see in the compliance field is that due to the high degree of regulation in certain areas, companies tend to just follow the rules to the letter instead of focusing on the measures with the greatest impact. And well, we all know we are living in times of crisis. Resources are scarce, especially for sustainability-related topics. So I think it's of utmost importance that we really critically reflect our due diligence approaches to allocate the resources wisely. I think that's a very first important thing. The second thing, and here I agree again, is collaboration. I think collaboration is key to not only solve the problem of resource allocation, but to really make sure that we design effective measures together with our stakeholders. And last but not least, I really believe that often when we have a regulation and when we only talk about what is required, how to implement it, but we forget the why. Why are we doing all this? And I think the root cause for many of the human rights and environmental violations we see is poverty. It remains poverty. And I think it's really important that we keep that in mind and really reflect if our measures help to improve this situation.
Yep, thank you. So, in effect, you're kind of saying we need to also keep the context in mind, the context of poverty and some broader driving factors that aren't really in the control of companies. There's also a big question around the right resource allocation and the right kind of efforts, really, that are perhaps not all just invited by the law, but might sometimes head into other directions. One thing that has changed, and Guido, as you pointed out, people have been working on this for a really long time, and particularly vulnerable consumer brands, we know have been doing a lot of work in this space. Over the last few years, we've had some developments, particularly in the technological space. And maybe, Sophia, a question to you. In terms of new digital possibilities, so we've had a lot of advancement in digitization. Also, even sourcing countries are considerably more digitized. Internet has spread across many places. A lot of mobile phones exist on this planet now, I think more than people. And I understand you're kind of trying to leverage that for impact on the human rights agenda. Can you tell us a bit more?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. And yes, agree with you. I think we've seen a shift throughout the last few years, especially driven by the pandemic, actually, where people are now used to using tech as a means to reach out. And just to give a little example of what happened during the pandemic, we were able to deploy trainings on important issues around, for example, personal safety and occupational health and safety in factories, even though nobody was able to enter those factories. So tech, I think, is here to stay, and tech is a great enabler of spreading knowledge. And if I could just back the tape a little bit, so the background of Quizrr and why we exist is actually knowledge, spreading knowledge, because we believe that knowledge is the great equalizer, and that knowledge is our path to impact. Because think about it, if you and I share the same knowledge, we're also able to talk about problems, we're able to solve problems. But if only I have that knowledge and you don't, it's really difficult for us to work together. So it's a simple sort of path to impact, but it does work. And I listened to the other panel participants and their speeches, and I think there are a few things that are extremely important to remember in spreading knowledge. You need to do it with respect, and you need to do it sort of with the end user in mind. So adapt to the local context, adapt to the situation that is in a certain market. So not a top-down structure, but rather a bottom-up structure. So what we do is that we transform these complex topics around, for example, worker representation, freedom of association, worker voice, harassment, etc., into really simple messages, you could say, live action films that are engaging and that are also bringing up the why question. And then we add an element of interaction with quiz questions and so on. And since we do that, and since we're a tech tool, we're also able to measure what is going on, what activities are happening in these facilities that maybe the brand has invited to the program. But just briefly then, to give you one example of one of the companies that we work with, VF Corporation, they are behind a lot of the sports brands in the world. They have done exactly what this law, I think, is asking for. So they have, for quite some time now, very thoroughly investigated their supply chain, where they identified challenges. And they look different in different markets. So could be forced labor when it comes to the large amount of migrant workers that are in the supply chain, or it could be, for example, anti-harassment or gender equality in other markets. They work with experts, so they've been working with, for example, IOM, United Nations organ for migrant workers, but also with other deep impact experts to identify how to approach these issues. They also work very closely with their suppliers, so they get the buy-in from the suppliers. And then they utilize tech. For example, our tool or other tools also for assessments and for learning and knowledge building, to be able to both sort of scale but also increase the reach and cascade the impact that they want to create. And lastly, I just want to say that what they also do is that they are transparent. They want to share their learnings. They want to share the data from the initiatives that they are running. And they also invite others to collaborate with them. And I think that's the key. You know, if we're going to be able to cascade impact globally, we need to work together. And I've heard that from everyone else, I think, in this forum today. But I think that's extremely important.
Great, thanks, Sophia. So, as you just said, that message of collaboration has come strong through really strongly from all speakers we've heard so far. And I think you make a really great point in saying, you know, that collaboration is based on a shared level of knowledge, and that we now have new digital tools to basically enhance that knowledge, also where it really matters, which is kind of at the bottoms of the pyramids and at the ends of the supply chains that we work with, where people are most likely to be negatively affected by labor or human rights violations. That also very much fits what others have said. We need to adopt localized approaches and be sensitive to individual contexts. So, yeah, there's a lot of potential things to do, a lot of things to consider, a lot of mistakes to avoid. Now, that brings me to somebody who's done a lot of strategies in this space. So, Thomas Uhlig, I wonder, what's your view after having worked with a variety of companies? How do you generally, when companies first start approaching this subject, and that's what will apply to a lot of people in our audience, they now work in companies who over the next 18 months are going to do this kind of, they're going to have to start getting into this. What is your advice to them?
Yeah, what we typically see is a different maturity of the companies. Have a long track record in doing sustainability, human rights topics on a voluntary basis. But what's the game changer, and Guido already mentioned that, is that we are now on a fundamental change from soft law to hard law. Rules that have been made to be obeyed voluntarily now change to be binding law with huge sanctions on it. And this is honestly a big game changer for any company we're working with. So very important for this purpose is first aspect, to have a clear strategy. That's usually my first advice, that the company needs a clear strategy, what are their targets, and to have a commitment of the management as well. So this is a very important aspect we usually do in the beginning of such projects, to align the path in the future, to have clear guidance for all the processes and all the details that will follow, and also have a clear top management commitment. This is really crucial, otherwise those projects and the endeavors of the company wouldn't be that successful. The second aspect, which is also really important, is to involve all relevant stakeholders. Stakeholders in the company, but also stakeholders outside of the company and the suppliers. This is a topic which isn't in the responsibility of a single department in the company, legal department, compliance department, sustainability department. Usually they all have their share in the success of implementing the processes which are needed to be successful in the future. So to early involve everyone who has their stake in that project is very important. And last but not least, it's very technical. So we have a lot of detailed or not so detailed regulations which companies now are required to have in place. But at the end, the purpose of all that needs to be always kept in mind. So it is the danger we are seeing is that companies are focused at 100% in implementing processes and technical stuff to have that in place because they have to. But at the end, the impact is on the human rights and in the environmental aspects. So to make also an impact on those, to improve situations where you see that are not doing well, and to also critically reflect what's your own share as a company what your contribution to that situation. And that's the key to fill this with life, with cultural and ethical aspects, as Guido already said. That's really important. I compare this with an instrument. All companies now have the legal obligation to have a certain instrument in their repertoire, but are they good musicians? No, not necessarily, but they have to learn how to play on this instrument to fill this with life, and this is a cultural aspect as well.
Okay, thank you. So again, at the end, the big pointer towards the cultural and the impact, while noting, yeah, you need to get everybody on board, you need to follow a clear strategy, you need to get the technicalities right, but those parts do not make up the total sum that you really need if you really want to impact what we all want to impact, which is human rights. Now, let's get to this question of measurement, or measurement is a particular word. Let's just ask, how would we notice that we're making a difference on the human rights agenda? I mean, Sophia, you've already kind of, I think with your technologies, you have some possibilities of picking some of these things up. But for example, Sarah, in your coffee supply chains, how do you notice when you're making a difference? Do you have feedback loops? Do you have data, well, information collection mechanisms? How does that work for you?
Yeah, that's a good question and a tricky one. With prevention, we always, if you prevent something, it's difficult to really measure the impact you generated. But I would like to share some examples with you. As I mentioned before, NKG has a sourcing program called NKG Bloom, which aims at improving the livelihoods of farmers and helping them to enter a pathway out of poverty. We, for example, help these farmers, train them on good agricultural practices, also gender rights. We provide them with access to fertilizers so they can improve their yields. And actually there we do have some very specific KPIs where we can see, for example, that the farmers improve their incomes, that, for example, they were able to send their children to school, that, for example, the quality of the coffee has improved, with then positive outcomes also on the social level. So that's something where we can specifically see the impact, and I think it's important to always keep in mind that human rights violations, environmental violations are always related, or in many instances related, to the environmental, to the economic situation of the stakeholders. So that's an angle we are taking through which we can aim at improvements.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think that last point you made, that there's always this complex concept, also makes it different. It's one thing to see change in local circumstances. It's another to figure out, okay, how much is due to what we've done as a company, how much is due to other initiatives. So yeah, I guess this is also a question for science and long-term research to really, it's not something that companies can only do by themselves. And this again brings us to that question of collaboration. Yeah, everyone here stressed it. And Guido, I think it was your primary number one tip. Yeah, collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. Can you, and there are numerous industry initiatives, sometimes they're industry-specific initiatives, sometimes they're topic-specific initiatives. When you look at, and I understand you have a pretty good and long overview, when you look at successful initiatives versus less successful initiatives, what are, in your view, the hallmarks of those that have done relatively well? Or maybe to phrase this question slightly differently, if a mid-sized company who's now for the first time dealing with human rights challenges and wants to do something about the risks it's identified and wants to go look for a collaborative initiative, what are the things they should watch out for?
What I would recommend is to be very suspicious about those initiatives where suddenly many companies participate, because it signals normally that this is the low-hanging fruit, not very demanding. and probably also not very effective with regards to human rights. Important initiatives are those, or a series of initiatives, are those that are imposing on companies significant changes, partly even changes in their supply chain, and independent audits and brutal transparency. So when your audit fails, it should be possible that I, as a consumer, can read that. I can read about it, and I want to know what you're going to do in order to fix that. Because one of the big mistakes companies make when it comes to communicating about these topics is they always try to give the impression how great they do, how sustainable it is what they do. Talk about problems, challenges, mention where you are going next and why it is so difficult to solve this or that problem, because that gives you credibility. And in order to solve these problems, you need the demanding partners, not the easy ones.
Okay, thank you. Interesting pointers. Sophia, you have something to add?
Yes, I would like to add the importance of fresh data or instant data when it comes to understanding the problems and communicating about the problems in your supply chain. Audit data might be old, 2-3 years old. Companies base their decisions on that kind of data. That's dangerous, I would say. So what I think tech can help with here is the more of a collection of fresh data. From our case, when it comes to the trainings, you go to the dashboard and you follow the process and the impact of the trainings that have been taking place. But also when it comes to assessments or audits, let's make sure that we have fresh data to base our decisions on. I think that's an important aspect.
Yep. Thank you, Sophia, and I see nodding heads amongst the other panelists. So fresh data. Now, and we also mentioned audits. Now let's get to a situation where data is saying things we don't want to hear. Yeah? Risks are manifesting, practices are bad, human rights are being potentially violated, labor rights situation is dramatic, health and safety circumstances poor. Any of these things, a company has done, potentially an audit, they had a corrective action plan, but the supplier doesn't move. What's the right way of dealing with it? And is it right to just cut ties? I wonder, I'm sure this is a question that comes up for you sometimes. And I know it's a mean question, but how do you advise companies to deal with this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In companies, this question isn't answered easily, of course. It has a legal impact, but also has an economic impact, and also has an impact on the human rights situation with the affected supplier. We have to see that it's very complex root causes that may lead to a specific situation. And of course, the attempt should be to work on those root causes to improve the situation. And this, of course, requires collaboration and monitoring if those measures are really effective. But at the end, at some point, companies might come to the conclusion, okay, there's probably nothing we could change because somehow the involvement or the collaboration of the supplier isn't in that way we would expect that. And for this reason, sometimes the decision has to be made to cut the tie, to terminate contracts on that. And of course, this always should have in consideration what will be the effect on the human rights situation as well. This is something which is also with regard to the German legislation, the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act is also one aspect which is laid down. So you have to consider what will be the impact, and it's only the ultimate ratio. So the preferred solution would be improve the situation, be patient, watch the success in this path, but at some point, there's no alternative than to terminate a contract, But of course, this also has an economic aspect. Do you have an alternative source for your products you have to have for your company?
Yeah.
So this is a complex topic, of course.
Yeah. So there's, I'd like to pick up on that last point because there's a, and I was thinking of you, Sarah. Indeed, I wonder there is a diversification challenge around this. If you're putting all your eggs in one basket in terms of procuring from a key resource from one supplier, naturally you have less possibilities of applying pressure and threatening with the decline of or the termination of business. It might make sense to adopt a diversification strategy for such highly important resources. How do you deal with this, Sarah?
Yes, so let me firstly comment on what Thomas just said. I think that what we see here it's a balancing act, right? If we identify violations, then obviously we want to make sure that they are ended and violations diminished. So I think the black and white approach doesn't really help here. To give you a specific example, I presented before the program we have called NKG Verified, where we clearly differentiate between the mandatory compliance with critical criteria such as child labor, forced labor, deforestation, and other criteria which, if identified in an audit, will lead to the development of a joint improvement plan. And the underlying understanding we believe here is that a black and white approach really doesn't help to address the challenges in our supply chains, but rather we need to accept and acknowledge these challenges and work together with our partners on improving them. However, I think it's really clear if you identify a severe human rights violation, or if you have been working with the supplier for a period of time on improving things and nothing does happen, then you need to take the appropriate actions. Now, coming back to what you just asked in regards to diversification of suppliers, I think that's an important aspect. In our case, as I showed before, our supply chains are very diverse and we source from hundreds of thousands of farmers. So here, diversification upstream is not an issue, but obviously also we as first-tier suppliers have key suppliers, and I think it's important for companies to really look at their responsible sourcing practices and really choose their key suppliers wisely, having these topics in mind and having established a relationship based on trust and mutual understanding where you can also address these topics. So in our case, our key suppliers in many instances have been working with us for many, many years. We know them personally, we regularly visit these suppliers. So there you already have a different basis from where you can discuss such sensitive topics.
Okay, thank you. I like your pointer, you've made it repeatedly, that we must never look at these things black and white. That also applies to, I guess, the diversity of a supply chain. Now, we're getting some questions from the audience, and I'm seeing questions here. One from Angelika Beans, who's asking, will those hard law requirements lead to deglobalization? And out of the corner of my, another question scrolled past where there was a particular question. Well, we do source some absolutely critical IT components from China where we see massive problems and we don't really know what to do about it. And I've had this conversation with textile industry executives who also said, large parts of our supply chain are in parts of the world that are heavily burdened with human rights risks, I would say. And yes, some of this are considering whether we can re-onshore some of those production facilities. So what do you make of that? And Guido, I thought maybe you have a view on this. You mentioned a certain colonialist view that we adopt here is the answer to decolonize, deglobalize. What's your view here?
It would be very revealing if one of the results of this law would be that companies realize that producing under conditions that respect human rights is too expensive.
Okay.
Because that shows that there is a lot of exploitation going on. I would rather say deglobalization will come from other drivers like the risks that we see with climate change, with wars. So this fear of disruption, where one wants to have key elements of the supply chain as close as possible. Think about Volkswagen. They had one key cable for many cars produced in one factory in Ukraine. In the future, these things will never be done again. And there will be more resilience in supply chains. I don't hope that respecting human rights will be so expensive that it leads to deglobalization. But I would not be surprised.
Okay, yes. Thank you. So that's a future that is yet to be written. Another question from the audience. I'll read it. It's a bit complicated, but good, I think. Kevin Hart, do most organizations on the meeting recognize or use primary source intelligence monitoring as a superior intelligence source over secondary data? I think with primary source, Kevin means information directly from suppliers, from communities versus the kind of statistical information that a lot of companies use for the abstract risk analysis. Maybe let's take that secondary data bit. I've worked with a fair bit of ESG and sustainability related data in my life and have found that a lot of the abstract stuff is very coarse. Sarah or Thomas, do either of you have much experience with that, working with companies or yourself working with secondary data to inform your supply chain management practices and risks?
Yeah, so we do use secondary data, and we have, for example, a tool which we use for our supplier due diligence, which helps us to screen suppliers to make sure they're not listed on any public list. Obviously, for our human rights impact assessments and risk assessments, we use a lot of publicly available secondary data. But we always try, so we always do that as a first step, and then the second step, we always try to dive deeper, especially when we identified certain risks, and then we try to gather primary data. So, for example, through assessments on the ground, through questionnaires, visits, personal visits, things like that. Studies.
Okay. Thanks, that makes a lot of sense. So kind of secondary data for the initial high-level screening and understanding your priorities and your potential risk exposure, and then you go primary, deeper on those areas, on the hotspots in a way. Okay. Sophia, you wanted to add something?
Yes, maybe I can just add. We work collaboratively across not only our own sort of field and sector, but across different industries. And combining different tech tools can support with this, collecting first-hand data or first-hand information from for example, let's say migrant workers in Jordan coming from Bangladesh, where we are working together with different companies and combining both the learning platform, but also a sort of grievance platform. Where workers can anonymously then report back to the factory management or to a third party outside the factory management. And I think tech can be a sort of supportive action here when it comes to getting firsthand reliable information, because it might not be threatening if you just package it right so that the worker understands and feels safe about using it.
Okay, thank you. Yep. So again, tech can also help a lot here. And I like that you just mentioned grievance mechanisms, whistleblowing solutions. I think there's more that can be done here to bring these kind of systems together and also use and perceive whistleblowing and grievance mechanisms and these hotlines that many companies are implementing now as a source of information about risk exposure and incidents. One more, also very interesting question from Basimane Modume-Dizi, sorry. Asking, how could we deal with the neo-colonial attitude perceptions in third world countries? If these are mainly legacy issues, and let's assume that for now, yeah, we have an anti-colonial attitude in third world countries due to legacy issues, things that colonialist countries have done in the past. What steps are in place to address that, to ensure investment objectives are not hindered based on historical events or some violating organizations? And maybe, again, that's a question to you, Sofie, because you do kind of, proactive communication, education in many of these countries. Is anti-colonial sentiment, the criticism of the white elephant that Guido mentioned, is that a hindrance, and do you have ways of, I guess, counteracting it and trying to turn it into something positive?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think it's extremely important. And Sarah, we actually, all of us have mentioned it. The information you bring to someone has to be brought to that person on that person's level. So to say that it should be useful information for me. And if we enforce information or practices from the top to the bottom, we will never change the world. We have to build the knowledge within each and every individual. The middle-aged woman in a textile factory in Bangladesh, or a young girl entering the electronics industry in India and so on, they need to be infused with knowledge that is usable for them and relatable for them. And if we do that, we can create change. But to do that, it's a painful journey, actually. You have to work with local experts. You have to listen to the worker in the factory. You have to understand the cultural context. So this is something we can do together, because the intel from all the companies that are sourcing globally, together with the collaboration that we all have with deep impact organizations on the ground or on a more global level, is a source of intel that we should bring to the table, all of us. And if we do that, if we share insights, we share data, we even share suppliers. A lot of the companies we work with, they source from the same factory. There's a lot of knowledge we can use there to make sure that we stop this top-down approach and start working with the people we're actually wanting to change their lives for.
Great, thanks, Sophia. So once again, a big pointer towards bottom-up, taking the bottom-up perspective, engaging those stakeholders there, educating them, but also listening to them and being perceptive to their needs. Also a big pointer towards information sharing and, once again, collaboration. Now, if that is what we say is probably the most important enabler of really impacting the human rights record globally positively, collaboration, it was earlier mentioned, does sometimes hit against the wall, which is antitrust regulation and privacy and questions such as that. Again, that's probably a question that comes up in your space a fair bit when you work with companies and as they're figuring out the strategies. What's your view there? How can companies approach that? Are there ways to basically, collaborate despite antitrust laws? What do companies need to watch out for?
Yeah, that's definitely a very important aspect. Unfortunately, all this new legislation is not a green fee to ignore antitrust laws. So it's the challenge is to collaborate, sharing information, have joint approaches to improve the situation, but at the same time adhere to the antitrust regulation. So of course, companies are well advised to have a look at those steps, information exchanges, and whatever they want, in particular also contract clauses from an antitrust law perspective. And at the same time, we see in the politics and in the common discussion going on that antitrust law should be shaped to be not an obstacle on that way, which is commonly recognized as a very important aspect. So what we see are first steps in the agricultural sector to make collaboration more easy, and for sure we need more clarification of the prosecution authorities of the European Commission to open up ways for companies to collaborate easier, as this topic is recognized as a very high important topic as well, also with the Commission and the public discussions. But now the measures have to be taken to make it easier for companies to collaborate.
Yep, thank you. So that's also a kind of call out to the regulator to keep that in mind as further regulation is shaped. And yeah, hopefully we'll see more on that front in the European, coming from the European Commission as well. So we're at the end of our time. Yeah, really interesting insights here. So there seems to be quite a lot of common agreement. The laws are good. They're heading in the right direction. Companies welcome them, or many companies welcome them, particularly, I guess, the human rights advocates in companies welcome them, and service providers, and they're pushing us in the right direction. At the same time, unilateral approaches of companies to try and kind of deal with these things in their supply chains are not likely to be highly effective. They should pursue collaboration, they should engage their stakeholders, they should be sensitive to local contexts, sensitivities, listen locally, understand that they cannot, shape everything. What they can shape is, and I'd just like to pick up Guido's warning of the double bind, is their purchasing practices, their pricing policies. That's a very significant detractor of successful human rights risk mitigation. So, onwards and upwards. Thanks so much to all my panelists. It's been a really fascinating discussion, inside and outside of the studio. And now back to my colleague Tanya. Thank you.